Wow, there was a huge number of correct guesses for this week's game, and rightly so, because it's one of the few ancient DOS games that stood the test of time extremely well, and that game is Wacky Wheels. Well, this isn't a perfect game by any means, and was originally made to cash in on the success of Super Mario Kart. There was nothing else like it on the PC at the time. Not to say there weren't any good racing games, since there was a bunch of them, but up until this game came out, virtually none of them utilized the texture-mapped surface to race upon, opting instead for solid colors and polygons since they're a lot simpler to render. It's curious that this game is still as playable as it is, given that it has a terrible frame rate and it's hard to see that far ahead of you. But even now, despite its age, it's still fun to play. Granted, it does have a few quirks you have to keep in mind. It definitely plays better when you have a second player to join in the fray, just like any racing game really. Well, let's just put it this way. Some games may age badly, but this is not one of them. Wacky Wheels was developed primarily by the two-man team of Andrew Edwardson and Sean Godala, going by the company name Beavissoft, and published through Apogee in 1994. It's a 1-to-2 player racing game with support for VGA 320x200 256 color graphics and multiple sound and music devices, though it's simplest to use its Sound Blaster support. As for its current release date, it's still shareware, and the registered version can still be obtained from the 3D Realms website at www.3drealms.com for $6. The shareware version can still be found from many places on the net, and features a fair amount of content on its own accord, so that's always an option if you're not quite sure if you want to get the full game or not. Wacky Wheels follows the exploits of some zoo animals which have escaped and are now racing go-karts because why the heck not? Before you get started though, you have a substantial number of settings to choose from, the first and least important choice being who you're racing as. You have a choice between 8 different racers: Tiggy the tiger, Blombo the elephant, Peggles the pelican, Morris the moose, Sultan the camel, Uno the panda, Razor the shark, and my usual pick, Ringo the raccoon. Though really, this choice is entirely superficial, as there's no gameplay differences between any of the racers. The next choice you have to make is your difficulty, though I'm going to go a little more in-depth into this later. The next choice is how many laps you want to run, either 6, 8, or 10, and this choice is basically just a matter of preference. The next choice, however, is rather interesting, as you can choose between 6 horsepower and 12 horsepower go-karts, effectively changing the speed of the gameplay, though without affecting the cornering, creating somewhat different dynamics as you race through each track. The final choice is between the original tracks and the bonus tracks, as there was a bonus pack released for the game a while back that effectively doubled the number of tracks you'd have, though the copy you can buy nowadays includes this pack by default. Then you just select a course of 5 tracks and start racing. The racing mechanics themselves are pretty straightforward, as all you need to do is complete a bunch of laps and try to make 3rd place or better. If you only get 4th or less though, you lose an extra life, and if you have any lives left, you can retry the race. Now, you guys might be thinking that's a terrible mechanic and that if you're sucking at the races you should be allowed to go forwards anyways, but remember that many games back in the day arbitrarily imposed extra lives on the player as a holdover from the arcade experience. I honestly have no idea why so many developers threw extra life systems into games that really didn't need them, when even Super Mario Kart has extra lives in it. One thing you're going to notice right off the bat though is that, again, just like Super Mario Kart, you have a number of items you can pick up in order to assist you in the race. And your ammunition of choice against your opponents, ironically enough, are hedgehogs. Yes, you seriously hurl hedgehogs at your opponents in order to slow them down. This is both a terrifying and awesome concept with metaphysical implications you don't want to think about. The other power-ups though are thankfully a lot more sane, and include a box of matches, which shoots a 3-way fireball attack, bombs and oil slicks you can drop for opponents to run into, Devil Pups, which are these red floating heads that slide from side to side once placed, and the 2-player mode specifically also has a power-up called Upside Down Hogs, which you drop on the track, and if your opponent hits it, it flips their screen upside down. Now, you're going to notice pretty quickly that most of the tracks are very difficult to race upon with the 12 horsepower engines. That is, until you learn how to perform handbrake turns. Pressing the handbrake button in this game while turning in a particular direction will give you a nearly immediate 90-degree turn in that direction without affecting your speed. Performing handbrake turns is essential to winning some of these tracks, but they take a lot of practice to get right, so it's very easy to oversteer when performing them. There's also jump pads and acceleration pads on many of the tracks, but these things primarily only serve to just give you a momentary boost of speed. The only other thing to mention about the gameplay in general is that it's actually possible to crash out. All you have to do is run headfirst into a solid object or end up in a head-on collision with an opponent racer. When this happens, you lose an extra life and have to restart the race. Simple enough. This game has a surprising amount of gameplay options, notably in the number of different game modes you have. In terms of single-player gameplay, there's the standard racing mode where you're trying to compete for points to make a podium finish. There's a time trial mode, which is good for practicing, though it also keeps track of the best lap and race times in a high score table. And there's also a special game mode called the Wacky Duck Shoot, where you pick a track and have 2 minutes to shoot down as many ducks as possible. The Wacky Duck Shoot is kind of a throwaway game though, as the ducks always follow a very predictable path, and I think is more to just give the player some practice with aiming and with the layout of the shootout tracks. In terms of 2-player gameplay, which I unfortunately don't have any footage of, you can race against each other via split screen, or there's also the ability to race across a modem link or serial cable. While this game could have been ridiculously awesome with 8-player networked gameplay, you'll notice there's no network support, as the modem and serial support was kind of a last-minute sort of thing, given that it was a heavily requested feature following initial testing of the game while it was still being made. The 2-player game modes basically boil down to racing with all 8 racers on the track, racing head-to-head, or there's also a shootout mode, where the goal is to be the first player to get to 5, 10, 15, or 20 points. The shootout mode is kind of fun, except that every time someone gets shot, the game pauses for a moment to award the point, then everyone's put back into their starting positions. I think it would have been more interesting if the person getting shot simply span out for a moment, then came back invulnerable and unable to shoot for a few seconds in order to re-establish themselves, but hey, that's just me. One last thing of note about this game's options is that it actually has the ability to adjust the engine sounds independently from the rest of the sound effects and music. I don't know about you, but I think this was ingenious since the sound of car engines in games can rapidly become annoying if they're not done extremely well, and it's good that you can adjust how loud they are relative to everything else. The difficulty is probably the only aspect of the game where I have any serious complaints, for the simple reason that there's no sweet spot. You can either make the game too easy or make the game too hard, and the reason for this is because of how the difficulty actually affects the gameplay. There's 3 main difficulty levels, referred to as classes: Amateur Class, Pro Class, and Champion Class. Each class appropriately scales up the speed of the opponent racer so that they're harder to get ahead of, with the lead opponent on Champion Class being virtually the exact same speed, meaning you absolutely must have the tracks mastered to get ahead of said opponent. This in and of itself would have made the game perfect in terms of difficulty selections. However, each class has the ability to allow opponent racers who are behind you to suddenly catch up by processing them faster for a moment. On Amateur Class, this happens pretty much completely at random and does rarely affect you. On Pro Class, opponents not only perform this catch-up move much more often, but only some of the opponents can perform it, and they're only allowed to catch up to about a quarter second behind you, which means if you're in the lead and make a mistake, you're likely going to drop down from first place to second, third, or maybe even fourth. Champion Class, however, not only allows every opponent to catch up, but allows them to catch up to just slightly ahead of you. This means it's nearly impossible to maintain the lead position for any length of time, because even if you shoot someone with a hedgehog and they fall behind, someone else will just pop ahead of you a split second later. Worse still, if they happen to run into you while performing this catch-up move, you could end up getting hit by the whole line of racers and drop from first position to 8th in a split second, and be stuck all the way back there for a substantial length of time as you try to work your way back to the front of the pack. Essentially, Champion Class is completely unfair and not even worth attempting, while Pro Class eventually gets too easy once you've got the tracks figured out. So yeah, this is a case where the game's been over-programmed, since without this catch-up feature, the different classes would have been perfectly balanced, and we wouldn't even be talking about this. Though one last thing of note is that there's a special Kids mode, which is much slower than the normal gameplay, only has 3 laps per race, and makes it so that you don't have to hold the accelerator button down to actually accelerate. Though if you don't, your cart will just continually sputter as a way of encouraging players to actually hold the accelerator down anyways. This mode is extremely easy to play and very slow paced, as it's meant for much younger children who want to actually play the game because of its cute and colorful graphics. While this mode does nothing for the typical game player, having it here for very young children is highly commendable, and I feel it's a part of what's helped the game stand the test of time as well as it has. Overall, despite the poor frame rate and the champion class essentially being broken, Wacky Wheels is incredibly fun to play, even nowadays. For anyone who enjoys racing games, this is definitely one to try out if you've never played it before. And even people who aren't typically into racing games might find something to enjoy here. Yeah, sure, it's ultimately a Super Mario Kart cash-in game, but that doesn't negate its enjoyment factor, and besides, not everybody had a Super Nintendo back in the day. Or, in my case, not everybody had Super Mario Kart. My SNES racing game of choice was actually F-Zero. DOSBox settings are simple enough, just leave cycle set to auto and you're good to go, though you'll probably want to turn off timed intervals for the joystick support too, and I highly recommend somebody uses a joystick or gamepad if you're going to be playing split screen 2-player, since you'll run into key lockups if both players try to use the keyboard. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week for episode 133, we're going to be taking a look at a racing game with animals in it. Wait a minute, that was the hint for today's game. Let me just see something here. Huh. Oh, guess what, guys? It's the hint for next week's game too. So make sure you send your guesses to adg@pixelships.com, because I think a bunch of you already know what game that's going to be.